In the late afternoon light of March 6, 1945, the stones of Cologne Cathedral stood like dark monuments to a world that seemed ready to tear itself apart. The square beneath them lay shattered, filled with dust, smoke, and the broken forms of buildings that had once echoed with the ordinary sounds of life. Across this haunted landscape, Feldwebel Karl Hoffmann pressed his eye against the fractured glass of his Panther's periscope. The moment was ordinary in appearance, yet deeply wrong. For 3 years he had studied every American tank silhouette, the way a surgeon studies anatomy, committed to memory with a professional's certainty. But what he saw now, emerging from the rubble-choked street, defied recognition. It moved with the familiar confidence of an American tank, yet its form carried a gravity and menace he had never seen. He whispered the thought that chilled him even before it left his lips. Das ist kein Sherman. That is not a Sherman. Through the spiderweb cracks, he glimpsed a gun that stretched far beyond the length of any he had encountered from American forces. The hull rode lower, angular, with a cast shape that carried the air of something new, something born not from battlefield adaptation, but from a quiet, methodical purpose. The turret looked oversized, almost disproportioned to the chassis, as though an anti-aircraft cannon had been welded atop a tank. Nothing matched his memory charts. Nothing fit. In that terrible uncertainty lay the first whisper of a truth that would echo across the final months of the war. Germany's long-held dominance in armored warfare was beginning to crumble. 18 seconds later, the truth would reveal itself in steel and fire. Just 3 minutes earlier, another German crew commanding a Panther under Wilhelm Bartelbohr of Panzer Brigade 106 had already learned it. Their tank lay quiet now, smoke curling from the turret like a dying breath. They had not even understood what had killed them. The answer had arrived with the thunder of a 90mm gun. The round fired by the new American tank cut through the air at nearly a kilometer per second, crossing the short distance between hunter and prey before Hoffmann could even blink. The Panther's thick frontal armor, which had deflected countless Sherman shots in Normandy, Belgium, and the Ardennes split open as though struck by a hammer far too immense to resist. The shell tore through steel, air, and human life with equal indifference before igniting the ammunition within. This was not merely a new machine. It was the physical embodiment of a shift in the war's mathematics, a change written not in doctrine or strategy, but in production lines, design tables, and the relentless ingenuity of American industry. For years, German tank crews had fought with the confidence of men who believed themselves untouchable. The Tiger, which first rolled into combat near Leningrad in 1942, had seemed invincible. Its armor stopped nearly every Allied round. Its gun could destroy enemy tanks before they came within half a mile. The psychological dominance was so profound that even the whisper of a Tiger as presence could stall an Allied advance. Soldiers across the front called it by many names, but all carried the same meaning: a beast of steel that could not be stopped. German crews lived inside machines that felt like fortresses, and their victories reinforced this faith. Tales circulated of single Tigers halting entire armored columns, of commanders whose kill lists rivaled those of fighter aces, of engagements where Shermans were destroyed before they ever fired a shot. The belief in German superiority became more than confidence, it became doctrine. Yet, as the war widened and the months passed, a quiet truth grew in distant factories far from the sound of artillery. In places like Detroit, Grand Blanc, and Philadelphia, thousands of anonymous hands worked not on the familiar Sherman, but on something else, something ordered in secrecy, tested in silence, and hidden even from many officers. Its name was T-26. Later, the world would know it as the M26 Pershing. Its story began 3 years earlier, not on the battlefield, but in the meeting rooms of the American Armored Command. By late 1942, the United States understood a painful reality. Its tanks were being outclassed. The Sherman, so reliable and so numerous, had been designed to fight an older generation of German machines. Against the Tiger and the Panther, it was simply outmatched, in firepower, in armor, in range, in nearly every measurable category. American commanders petitioned for a new design, something built not merely to survive, but to dominate. The result was a program that spanned 14 major contractors, hundreds of subcontractors, and tens of thousands of workers. Fisher Body alone retooled massive automotive plants to cast new turrets, machine new guns, forge new armor. The scale of the effort was unprecedented. And yet, almost no one outside the program knew what was being built. The 90mm gun chosen for the tank was powerful enough to penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor. New casting techniques were developed for its turret. New transmission systems were designed from scratch. Workers assembling the machines were told they were building an improved Sherman variant. Shipments were labeled as maintenance equipment. Even the crews chosen to serve in them trained behind fences, sworn to secrecy, their movements restricted. In January 1945, under the cover of darkness, the first 20 Pershings were loaded onto ships bound for Europe. Wrapped in waterproof shrouds, disguised on shipping manifests, hidden behind rows of ordinary Shermans, they crossed the Atlantic without a single intercepted signal. When they rolled off the ships at Antwerp, no German observer witnessed their arrival. To the Wehrmacht, to German intelligence officers, and to tank crews like Karl Hoffmann, the United States had never built a true heavy tank. They believed American industry too rigid, too slow to pivot, too focused on mass production to create something capable of rivaling the Tiger. They believed it because it had always been true. But now, in the quiet turbulence of early 1945, that truth died. The Pershings were assigned to the 3rd Armored Division, hidden among the columns of Shermans moving toward the Rhine. Their orders were strict: avoid combat unless necessary. Do not reveal yourselves unless facing German heavy armor. Maintain secrecy above all else. Yet war rarely respects caution. In February, a Pershing nicknamed Fireball was lost in a sudden ambush by a Tiger. Even in defeat, the tank proved resilient enough to be repaired and returned to service. By early March, rumors began to drift through German ranks, rumors of a new American machine with a long gun and thick armor. But rumors do not prepare minds hardened by years of battlefield dominance. And so, on March 6, 1945, in the shadow of Cologne Cathedral, as Hoffmann's eyes strained through broken glass to identify the shape approaching through dust and ruin, the final era of German tank supremacy stood seconds from its end. He could not have known that across the front, men like him were whispering the same words. This is not a Sherman. He could not have known that the film camera positioned nearby would immortalize the moment forever. And he could not have known that in those few seconds between uncertainty and destruction, the myth of German invincibility built through years of victories, reinforced by steel and blood, was unraveling. He only knew that something unfamiliar was coming toward him. Something low, something powerful, something that reflected no weakness in its silhouette. A new shape in the war, a new sound, a new fear. The modified bomber lifted from the pierced seal runway with the slow, heavy grace of a hunting bird rising from water. Its engines roared, yet inside its cockpit there was only a profound stillness, a silence born from the awareness that every man aboard now carried a secret that could not be spoken, a weapon that was not supposed to exist, born from defiance and desperation. As the bomber climbed into a sky still stained orange by the dying sun, Captain Paul Irvin Gunn leaned forward in his seat, hands resting lightly on the controls. He felt the aircraft's subtle tremors, the way its nose pulled differently, the faint imbalance of weight where the bombs should have been but were not. That empty space had been repurposed, claimed by a new Idea 8. 50 caliber machine guns arranged in a configuration no American manual had ever approved, all angled forward, all waiting for an order that did not officially exist. Below him, New Guinea stretched like an endless green labyrinth. Valleys swelled and folded into each other, cloaked in jungles so dense that even the noon sun could not penetrate the canopy. Rivers glimmered like silver serpents twisting through the wilderness. It was vast, ancient, and indifferent. And somewhere within that expanse, hidden, fortified, supplied by air and sea, were the positions that had cost American lives for months. Gunn exhaled slowly. He knew the terrain. He knew the cost. He knew that every mile beneath him had been carved with blood. The bomber leveled off at a medium altitude. The crew settled into their rhythm, but even routine felt different tonight. The men moved with a taut awareness, stealing glances toward the nose where a bombardier would normally sit. Instead, an armored box had been built rushed together with scrap. Reinforced steel, whatever they could find, and inside that box lay the heart of their new weapon. The gunners whispered to each other over the intercom, their voices low, reverent, almost prayer-like. They were not discussing target grids or timings. They were wondering, quietly, whether the thing they had built would work, or whether it would tear the aircraft apart the moment it opened fire. The jungle wind buffeted the bomber lightly, as if reminding them of their fragility. As they approached the first ridge beyond Port Moresby, the radios crackled with distant chatter from other Allied aircraft, reports of scattered enemy movement. Transports spotted near the coast. A few murmurs of anti-aircraft batteries being repositioned deeper inland. But none of that was their mission. Tonight, their mission was to test an idea that the Army Air Force had already rejected, an idea born from battlefield necessity rather than doctrine. Captain Gunn checked his watch. 5 minutes, he said quietly. The crew shifted. Harnesses tightened. Gloves adjusted. Breath steadied. Below the clouds, the world darkened. A heavy fog rose along the mountains, swirling like pale smoke. Gunn knew those valleys well enough to navigate without perfect visibility. But the jungle's shadows always carried a sense of presence, as if eyes watched from every fold in the terrain. At last, the aircraft dipped through the clouds and descended to a dangerous altitude, flying just above the treetops. Branches whipped beneath the fuselage like claws reaching upward. The terrain rolled violently. Every adjustment had to be precise. Every second demanded full attention. The intercom crackled. "Skipper, I've got movement," one of the waist gunners whispered. "Where?" "North slope. Looks like vehicles. Hard to see through the fog." Gunn narrowed his eyes. Through the drifting mist ahead, faint shapes emerged, hints of a clearing. Outlines of roofs, the hard angles of bunkers and dugouts. Lantern light flickered between narrow slits in the foliage. A forward base. A real one. Not empty. Not abandoned. Alive. He felt his pulse quicken, but his voice remained steady. "Stand by the nose guns." A silence followed, thick, tense, electric. It was the silence before an invention was born. Or destroyed. The plane dipped lower. The fog thinned. Below them, the Japanese outpost appeared in full view, supply crates stacked like miniature fortresses. Trucks parked in rows. Soldiers moving between shelters, unaware of the shadow passing above them. Gunn glanced toward the armored box in the nose. Inside, Staff Sergeant Gale Cleven braced himself before the controls of the improvised weapon. 8 barrels glinted faintly in the dimming light, aligned like the fangs of a metallic predator. "Gale," Gunn said, his tone calm, almost gentle, "when we make the pass, test it with a short burst. Don't hold the trigger too long." "Understood." They circled wide, gaining just enough distance to line up the run. The bomber straightened. The clearing ahead expanded in the windows. Trucks, fuel drums, troops, all perfectly exposed. Gunn could feel every heartbeat in the aircraft. Every breath the crew took seemed synchronized with the steady thrum of the engines. Then he spoke the words that no manual had ever prepared them to hear. "Cleven, fire." For a moment, Cleven hesitated, not out of fear, but out of awe. His finger hovered over the trigger. He exhaled once, deeply. Then he squeezed. The roar that followed did not sound like machine guns. It sounded like a thunderclap exploding inside a steel chamber. 8 .50 caliber guns erupted at once, their combined fury pouring forward in a blazing torrent of fire. The nose of the aircraft shook violently, so violently that every man aboard felt as if the entire bomber might rip apart in midair. But it did not. It held. The stream of tracers tore through the clearing below like a red-hot scythe. Trucks disintegrated. Fuel drums burst into erupting fireballs. Canvas roofs shredded. Earth leapt from the ground as bullets carved deep furrows through the camp. The soldiers below scattered in panic, some diving for cover, others frozen in shock at the sight of a bomber behaving like a giant airborne rifle. The guns cut off. Silence except for the engines flooded the cockpit. Cleven sat motionless, chest heaving. Gunn looked over at him. "Well?" he asked quietly. Cleven swallowed. "It works," he whispered. Gunn's lips tightened into the faintest hint of a grim smile. "Yes," he murmured. "It does." But even as the crew exchanged stunned glances, a new sound rose from the rear of the jungle, deep, resonant, unmistakable. The crack of anti-aircraft guns. Gunn's expression hardened instantly. "Hold on," he said. "They're waking up." The bomber banked sharply, swinging around for a second pass. The invention had worked. Now they would discover the cost. The bomber rose above the trees, its engines vibrating with a subdued triumph. Below, the jungle lay scarred, blackened, and silent. The outpost, once bustling with life, now resembled a hollowed-out relic of an earlier world. Smoke drifted upward in narrow ribbons, twisting toward the fading light of the late afternoon sky. The men inside the aircraft did not cheer. They did not celebrate. There was only a quiet, solemn understanding of what had been accomplished, and the knowledge of the immense responsibility that now rested upon them. Captain Gunn sat for a long moment, hands loose on the controls, gazing at the terrain below. The operation had proved the concept beyond doubt. The modification worked. The 8 forward-firing, 50-caliber guns mounted in defiance of doctrine had transformed a standard bomber into something more than a machine, a predator, precise and unstoppable in its specific mission. And yet, for all the engineering and ingenuity, Gunn understood the subtler truth of what they had achieved. This was not only about destruction. It was about fear, about perception, about the shift in understanding that occurs when a force previously believed secure is confronted with something unexpected. Through the forests and rivers of New Guinea, the Japanese soldiers' experience mirrored what European tank crews would come to feel months later. A weapon, unforeseen, capable of killing without warning, produced a psychological effect far greater than its raw numbers might suggest. A few moments of devastation, and the mind recalculates the world, the possibilities, and one's own vulnerability. The act of seeing, of witnessing an impossible machine, is often more profound than the act of destroying. Across oceans and continents, a parallel story unfolded in Europe. In the ruins of Cologne, the M26 Pershing rolled into history not with the vast numbers of Shermans that had preceded it, but with a presence that defied its small quantity. Its 90mm gun, its low profile, its heavily cast turret-all were built to challenge assumptions. German tank crews, hardened by years of war, veterans of battles across the eastern and western fronts, suddenly faced a threat they had not anticipated. The Panthers and Tigers, machines that had inspired awe, were now vulnerable in ways previously unimaginable. Through shattered streets, rubble, and smoke. The first engagements between Pershing and Panther were brief, decisive, and recorded in rare, trembling reports. A single round, fired with precision, shattered both steel and confidence. Tanks that had stalked their prey with certainty now hesitated. The first shots carried not just physical destruction but a subtle psychological force, the sudden awareness that the rules had changed, that an opponent had arrived who could match every advantage once thought inviolable. The stories of these encounters traveled swiftly, carried in whispers, in intelligence reports, and through the frightened voices of crews. What made the Pershing uniquely effective was not only its technical capability, but the uncertainty it introduced. To German crews, the long gun on a seemingly familiar American tank became an omen. Every Sherman sighted could now be a Pershing. Every approach demanded caution, hesitation, second-guessing. Even the veterans who had survived the greatest battles of the war felt the unease of the unknown. Fear, once numerical, now became conceptual. By the time the first 20 Pershings saw combat in February and March of 1945, Germany's industrial and military machinery was already faltering. Resources were depleted, supply lines fragmented, morale declining. Into this already fragile system arrived the embodiment of American ingenuity and industrial capacity, a weapon that symbolized a nation, capable of learning, adapting, and exceeding expectations while maintaining its industrial rhythm. The Pershing was more than a tank. It was a statement, a challenge, and a mirror reflecting what had been assumed impossible: that democracy, mass production, and innovation could meet and rival totalitarian engineering on the battlefield. As the weeks passed, the effects became clear. German tank crews who had relied for years on technical superiority to sustain morale and doctrine began to retreat at first contact. Positions that had been held for days now fell in hours. The presence of a Pershing, or even the suggestion of one, was enough to induce caution, hesitation, and sometimes surrender. Mechanical failures were reported with increasing frequency, minor problems suddenly insurmountable. Soldiers abandoned vehicles that could have been repaired with simple tools. The psychological calculus had shifted. Survival now depended on avoiding what might be, rather than confronting what was. Even where no Pershing had fired a round, the shadow of the American heavy tank influenced decisions. Crews learned to doubt their senses, to question intelligence, to hesitate when previously they would have charged. The belief in German technological invincibility, built over 3 long years of war and countless victories, was crumbling not because of overwhelming force but because of perception. The Pershing had proven that belief could be as potent as any weapon, and its revelation could be as devastating as a barrage of shells. By the final weeks of April 1945, the effect was unmistakable. German armored resistance collapsed. Units that possessed operational Tigers and Panthers refused to engage unless certainty was absolute. American forces, advancing with combined columns of Shermans and Pershings, met minimal organized opposition. Tank aces, once celebrated for their precision and fearlessness, abandoned their vehicles rather than risk confrontation with a possible Pershing. Surrender, once a last resort, became a practical decision in the face of uncertainty. The war's balance, built on years of training, doctrine, and technology, had shifted not by numbers alone, but by the perception of industrial and technological parity. The Pershing's legacy extends beyond its rounds fired or tanks destroyed. It represents a lesson in the intangible forces that shape conflict: fear, uncertainty, morale, and perception. It is a testament to the profound impact that innovation, applied with foresight, can have on even the most hardened forces. For every soldier who faced it, the Pershing was more than steel and gunpowder. It was proof that the assumptions upon which they had relied were no longer valid, and that survival depended on understanding that the world could change swiftly and without warning. In museums today, the Pershing sits silent, alongside its contemporaries, a relic of war, a symbol of ingenuity, and a reminder of the subtle power of perception. To stand beside it is to feel the weight of history, not only the weight of armor, but the invisible weight carried by those who realized, too late, that their supremacy was no longer guaranteed. It is a story not of overwhelming force but of psychological precision. A story of how 20 tanks, moving through Europe with deliberate secrecy, could alter the course of battles, the decisions of seasoned veterans, and ultimately the morale of an entire army. The M26 Pershing, in its quiet, relentless effectiveness, changed the war not through numbers alone, but through the revelation that no advantage is permanent, that industrial capacity and innovation can redefine what is possible, and that the mind of a soldier is as vital a battlefield as any valley, town, or city. The hunters became the hunted. The myth of invincibility shattered. And in the eyes of those who faced it, a new understanding of the war and of human ingenuity emerged: calm, inexorable, and irrevocable.